name of the game that we were talking about last time was the decline, as we titled of the old order, which means the crisis in which traditionalist Judaism, as I defined it, was hammered and subjected to in the last part of the 18th century, and as we'll see in the first part of the 19th century, which really led to its either collapse or serious crisis, and its replacement by other forms of Judaism which begin to be more familiar with us with the profile of the Jewish world that we have today, whether one likes it or not. And I mentioned Moses Mendelssohn and the different trends with which he was connected. And if my memory serves me correctly, and if it doesn't, we're in trouble. The point I think I was making was that Mendelssohn and represented the real Mendelssohn, not the mythical one, represented an opposition to the cultural insularity that had been such a core element of traditionalism. And also, I think I ended in this point with the fact that by the time came to the 1780s, he also was expressing doubts in paper or in print with another key element of traditionalist Judaism, not the belief in God and the Torah and all that, but the coercive kehilos, that the Jewish people, Judaism, is defined, among other factors. It's not the only way it's defined, but one of the core ways in which it used to be defined is a community and not a club. A community means you have force. If you don't have force, it's a club. You want to join a show in America, you do. You don't like it, you leave. What I was talking about for 1,000 years and more was a situation in which you don't leave, you can't leave. The Catholics can't leave theirs, the Protestants can't leave theirs, the Muslims, of course, can't leave theirs, and the Jews can't leave theirs. So wherever you live, you are compelled by law and by Jewish law, externally as well as internally, to be a tax-paying member of your community. Most of the time you didn't get to necessarily decide how much taxes to pay, which of course led to all kind of strife and crises in all the communities. There never was such a thing as a Kehillah in Jewish history, which wasn't torn in half. That's quite a statement I'm making, which wasn't torn in half between various factions over taxes, over money, obvious reasons. And the norms of the community are enforced by coercion. That the communities had the right, in one way or another, either through financial coercion, which is a little bit easier, or through physical coercion, which is a little bit rougher, to compel obedience to the conformity to the norms of the community. So that's all the way it used to be. And by the time you get to the 18th century, in Christian Europe, there began to be people who questioned this. It had nothing to do with the Jews. It has to do with the Enlightenment, with people like John Locke and later Voltaire and Diderot and Rousseau, who said maybe religion is not an area which should be subject to coercion. Maybe religion should be voluntary. That was considered shocking by Christians, by Jews, and it still is shocking to Muslims. And, because if it's God's word, it's right. And if it's the right thing, you don't have a choice whether to keep Shabbos or not. I mean, you feel like it. You don't feel like it, you have to do it. You don't have 613 suggestions or something. Right? They're commandments. So there's I'm telling you, it's a sea change in outlook. It's a paradigm shift. And somebody like Mendelssohn simply represents the first Jewish stirrings, certainly in paper, of somebody who says, maybe we should still keep the Kehillah, but we shouldn't have the coercion. How you do that, he never dealt with because he died a year or two later after he wrote that. But you see the beginnings of the erosion or the challenging of truths that had been central for so many centuries. And so you begin to see what we call the modern era. Now, at the same time, that's not all that defines modernity. That's just one guy's opinion, Moses Mendelssohn. There are much bigger trends that have a much wider impact. And I turn now to the third or even bigger impact. And that is that as a result of writings by Mendelssohn and others, something very unexpected happened in 1781. And that was, let me get the That was that the Austrian Emperor, you see here's the Austrian Empire. It was called, the official title was the Holy Roman Empire, but as you see it's a different color. The House of Habsburg ruled a large area in the middle of Europe, Bohemia, Austria, and Hungary, which is called the Austrian Empire. And in 1780, a new emperor came on the throne, Joseph II, and he was interested in modernizing to some extent his realm. He was what you call an enlightened despot, and well, that's the term they give for it. That's the term. And what that meant was, how do you get the most money out of your lands? How do you make it work the best? Efficiency expert. And Austria had fought these huge wars with Prussia. This map's a little bit early, from the early part of the 18th century, but just take it from me. Prussia over here by the 1780 was much larger, it's that big. And there have been these wars all through the 1700s, and the bottom line is the new emperor, Joseph II, he wants to make some changes, and as I say before, make his state, his empire, more profitable and more efficient. And Austria is German right there, but the rest of the empire is very much not German. This is Czech, this is Hungarian and Slovak and Romanian and Croatian and Slovenian and 100 other different nationalities. And how do you make that work as one Medina? And so what he wanted to do, being a German autocrat, was Germanize everybody and Europeanize everybody, make everybody act the same. This was his goal. The result of his policies, I might say, was that he provoked huge revolts here, and all over the place, and he died without having accomplished that. But in 1781, when he first was on the throne, he turned to the Jews. And at that time, the largest Jewish community in the empire was here in Bohemia, Prague, right down there. And this map, as I say, a little out of date. By 1780, he also ruled this southern part of Poland, Galicia, which we all know, the Galicianos, that's a big Jewish community also. And he issued what was called the Edict of Toleration, the Toleranz Patent, in which for the first time you have a kind of a demand for a quid pro quo, which is absolutely unprecedented in Jewish history and did not bode well at all. Because what he said is that we'll ease up a little bit on the discrimination, and in return we want you to ease up a little bit, or more than a little bit, on your autonomy and your insularity. We will, instead of making the Jews pay 8 or 9 times taxes that the non-Jews have to pay, we'll cut it down to, let's say, 3 times the taxes, which was a substantial saving. We will do away with some of the economic restrictions. So it used to be in Austria, if you're Jews, you can only sell clothes or horses or something like that. Really. And we'll let you go into the lumber business and the real estate business and other things like that, which is a life and death matter. It's not a small thing for Jews living there. They're always facing terrible poverty and taxes. And so there were real economic concessions held out in this way, like you would do to a baby, like candy. But in return, we want the Jews to stop speaking Yiddish, stop conducting their businesses in Yiddish. And most importantly, and other things like that, most importantly, he said we want the Jews to, he didn't use these words, but this is what it amounts to. We want the Jews to Germanize. And specifically, we want every Jewish kid to have a public school education, which means in Europe, up to the 6th grade. They don't have over there high school for free. And at that time, what's wrong with having the 3 R's in a reading, writing, arithmetic? And we want that every Jewish child, certainly in the area of Bohemia, which is he ruled directly in Austria, we want every Jewish kid to have a state-certified secular education, what you and I call public schools, and therefore we open all the Christian schools without qualification to Jewish students, in fact up to the university level. And if you don't trust me, he says, this is what it writes there, and you think there's a plan to convert the Jews, which it was, no, it was, set up your own schools under government supervision. Let's have each Jewish community set up a school which will teach the 3 R's under Jewish supervision. Let's have Jewish teachers, provided you have the right textbooks and the right curriculum and all the rest of it, which is of course what we have in Baltimore, Maryland today. Well, this is the first time ever any Gentile paid notice in the slightest way to what's going on in the internal cultural affairs of the Jewish community, specifically education, chinuch as we call it today. Until then, the Jews had the good fortune of being so condescended to by the host governments in which they lived that if you asked a German king or a French prince or an Italian or the Pope, what do the Jews actually do in terms of schooling and culture and other? Who cares? It's stupid Jewish stuff. I don't know, some kind of crazy version of the Bible, Jewish custom. Who cares what those idiots do? And the Jews liked that because what that meant was that nobody's interfering in their internal affairs, and that's why until 1781 there never was a case in which there was any kind of outside pressure at all to interfere in the education that went on within the Jewish community, and now there's going to be a change in that regard. And he was serious about it, and right away in 1782 he had his officials go to the main Jewish community in the empire, which was Prague, which was the largest Jewish community in Europe, 10,000 Jews. That was considered gigantic. Vilna at this time, where the Vilna only had 4,500 people, 400 or 500 Jews already. And he goes there. Prague is a famous, kahila. I don't have to tell you, long-standing Jewish traditions. And the rabbi was the Noda Yehuda, one of the great rabbis. And he basically said like this: "Work with me. Let's put together the public school." And the interesting thing is that the Noda Yehuda, obviously, and his colleagues were very opposed to this, but the people in the community had no problem with it. They said, what's wrong with reading, writing, arithmetic? And you can't lead a charge if the soldiers don't follow you. And it's very interesting to read about this, all in German, that Count Schulstein, who was the Minister of Education, went repeatedly to Prague, to the Noda Yehuda. He said like this: "I'm willing to meet you here, but tell me what you want." And they said, "Well, we don't trust the textbooks." "Okay, what textbook do you want?" "We want to be in charge of the teachers." "No problem. We want to make sure that this doesn't interfere with our religious studies." "Okay, so what time of the day you want to do it?" The point was that the officials were very clever in a very polite way, getting what they wanted, and what they wanted, of course, was to get a foot in the door, no matter how small. And so I can tell you that by the time the negotiations were over, what was set up in Prague was a school run by Jews, which will be from 4 o'clock to 6 o'clock every day, 4 days a week, for kids from 10 years old and above, so that way they don't interfere with the cheder. And you see what I'm saying? They hedged it around with all kinds of limitations, so that as much as possible, the traditionalists did. They should not interfere with the traditional cheder education and the primacy given to Limudei Kodesh, and specifically to Talmud and things of that nature. Here they'll revisit it and they'll say, instead of 99% Gemara and 1% mathematics, you understand that eventually they're going to be pushing to the reverse, and to the point where it's 100% mathematics. This really was a trend that begins in the early 1780s and spread like wildfire over the next 20 years in the German states. As I said before, this happened in Prague over here, but within a short time, the news of this had gotten around and radically encouraged all throughout the German states. Maskilim, people who were followers of Moses Mendelssohn, and much of the time were not as religious as him. If you remember, Mendelssohn himself came from an extremely religious family and had nothing but a yeshiva education. Many of the people I'm talking about were a younger generation who grew up in the 1760s already, in the 1770s, didn't have that education, and more importantly, had a different outlook. They were not committed to nomianism or fundamentalism, as the expression goes. They're not committed to the nomianism, which is the keeping of the laws, and the fundamentalism, which is the basic beliefs of Judaism. And many were, though, can't paint with too broad a brush, many of the Maskilim were Shomer Shabbos, as we would say today, but they all agreed that what had happened over here should be repeated, which is there should be set up within every Jewish community a public school, so to speak, in which the Jewish kids will all be taught Limui Chol, even if it's in a very elementary level, because that will be a better method for preparing the children for getting a parnasa later on in life, armed with the basic tools of language communication and things of that nature. It's the kind of thing that most people in this room would agree with today. But 200 years ago, and a little more than that, it was an extremely controversial issue, because what is the end result? Are we talking about Orthodox Jews armed with a secular education, or are we talking about something different than Orthodox Jews? The traditionalists fought this all across Germany, and you can trace it. There's a book, actually, by Professor Elio, which goes, city by city. And it takes about 20 years or so, but it did happen. This is the great accomplishment, the great negative accomplishment of the Berlin Haskalah. It's not the writings, and it's not the articles and papers or things of that nature, the literary remains. It's the fact that in one community after another, certain section of the community, let's say it's a community of 500 families, so 30, 40 families will go to the Duke, or to the Prince, or to the Elector, as they would call it in Germany, and say, the other 300 families in the community are too, how shall we put it, unenlightened, and they don't understand the necessities of the time. But we do. And so what I want you, the Duke, to do is compel, through the police power of the state, changes in the education of the community. In other words, you will give an order, which you, the Duke, or the Prince, or the Bishop, can do to require every kid in the community, every family, to send their kids to the school that I'm going to set up, me and my friends. And the screaming and howling that took place, as you can imagine, by the traditionalists from one end of Germany to the other, it didn't matter, because once the governments were convinced that this was a matter of spreading popular enlightenment, of education, then obviously the protests are only coming from primitive people who don't know any better, and those protests are to be disregarded. And to make a long story short, within a generation, you change an entire generation of young people in Germany from one model to another. Now, I didn't say they all became non-religious, because none of these schools actually preached. None of these schools preached irreligion. But in order to maintain the traditionalism, you needed more than a school that doesn't preach irreligion. They weren't getting the positive reinforcement. The new staff of teachers are the 30 families, the masculine from each community, who are committed to changes, obviously, as they would see it, reforms and improvements in the traditionalism. For example, they decried the excessively narrow curriculum with its focus on nothing but Gemara, Gemara, Gemara. And they want something beyond that. Of course, that depends on which community you're located in. Some cases that might mean that in addition to Gemara, you actually have something as radical as Tanakh. In other communities, it might mean, and it did, that you want Gemara eliminated and replaced with German literature. You see? So, although there never was a frontal attack on the Torah, there never was a frontal attack on the observance of mitzvahs, but de facto it happened. And there was a general weakening all across the 1780s, 90s, and the first decade of the 1800s at the local level. So I'm talking about a revolution that takes place, which is not so much a matter of ideology, although it's ideologically driven, as it is a matter of education. And this bespeaks one of the key elements that we are now familiar with at this late stage of the modern era, which is the only thing that matters in any Jewish politics is education. All the rest of it is not important. Who controls the education and the nature of the education completely determines the Jewish future. Anything else is not relevant. And that's something that traditionalists were completely unfamiliar with, because that was not the case. For 2,000 years, let me put it to you in one word: women. There was no such thing as, as education for women. Not in traditionalism. I'm not talking about generally. There were no schools for girls. Think about that. And yet, in all these different environments and climates, you have various religious women. Means, bottom line, you don't need schools to keep people religious. And same thing for boys. You didn't need schools to keep people religious once upon a time. If you go back to the 1700s, the 1600s, the 1500s, and all the way back, the schools in the Jewish communities generally were pretty lousy. That's a davar yedua. And the Cheders had many big problems with them. And thoughtful Jewish educationists called attention to this over the many centuries. The Maharal of Prague, the Kli Yakar, the Tosfos Yontiv, many others have extensive writings in which they decry the terrible failures of the Jewish educational system. But they were not listened to. And the reason they weren't listened to is because it didn't matter. And the reason it doesn't matter is because no matter what the kids learn in school or don't learn in school, when you're living in a small community in Germany or in Poland or in Italy, you're going to grow up to be like your parents, and that's the way it is. That's the Catholics are growing up that way, the Protestants are growing, and the Jews are going to grow up that way. So you won't necessarily know all the laws of Shabbos. You'll know how to keep Shabbos like you and I know how to keep Shabbos. What we see around us, not because we're Buckies necessarily in all the rules of the Mishnah Berurah, although if you want to be honest about it, you have to know all those rules. But nobody knew all those rules, except a few. And you stay Shomer Shabbos anyway, whatever that means. And same thing for Kashrus, and you know what to do when Hanukkah comes around, and you know what to do when Pesach comes around. And that's what traditionalism was. It's mimetic, as they call it. You know, you mime, you mimic what you see around you. And, you know, we can have a nice discussion which form of education is better, but nevertheless, that's the way it was. And consequently, whether the schools are good or bad, whether the Rebbe hits people with a stick, who cares? And that's why, even though we pay lip service in traditionalist Judaism to the idea of the supremacy, the supreme value of Torah education, Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam, but education was the only institution that was not funded or supervised by the traditionalist Kehillah. It's interesting. They didn't have a board of education. It was caveat emptor. Somebody sets himself up as a Rebbe or a Malamed, you have the right to send your kid to him, and then he can pull it out anytime you want. If he's good, obviously by definition he'll draw customers. If he's not good, he won't. It was completely capitalist, and it was not regulated, and it's strange. I tried to portray to you a Jewish environment which was dominated by rules and regulations and coercion. So why not chinuch? That's the most important. I'm speaking now as a modern person when I say it's the most important. In reality, in the old times, people did not pay attention to it because it didn't matter. Now we're beginning a period in Jewish history in which it's going to matter, and matter big time. Why? First of all, as I said before, for the first time, starting in the 1780s, the European governments start to interfere and direct and form the content and the nature of chinuch, or the absence of it, for the first time. And secondly, the general trends that were taking place in Europe at that time anyway were pushing in this direction. By that I mean that, just thinking which way to go first with this. I'll go economic. The period that I'm talking about is not only the period that I just described in which the European governments for the first time start to want to regulate what Jews are doing in their own communities in terms of education. Think about that. You have a Catholic emperor trying to tell the Jews how to do Judaism. But you had that. But in addition to that, we're now talking about the beginnings of what we call the Industrial Revolution, which in simple terms means that the governments in Europe said we're stepping aside and regulating everything. We're going to try a certain amount of laissez-faire. We're going to go for capitalism. And the old model that had existed in Europe for well over 1,000 years, you had the old idea of the guilds and the monopolies. You know, there's only room in town for one pizza shop. And the guy who has the pizza shop has lived here forever. And he's entitled, and his wife probably is also from the town. And he's a good upstanding citizen. And he pays his taxes and does his work within the community. He's entitled, the Christians said for century, to the protection of his parnasa. Think about that. He's entitled to the protection of his economic livelihood. What do you want his family to starve? And if somebody else will open another pizza shop, it'll undercut him, it'll go out of business. And that wouldn't be fair. And therefore, based on this, they had this idea of the restraint of competition. The Jews, I might say, struggled with this issue throughout the Middle Ages. The Jews, even though in the Gemara you have none of this, but nevertheless it arose. It's called Cheskas HaYishuv. Does a Kehillah have the right to blackball somebody who wants to move in because he might be competition with somebody who's already here? And Rashi held one way, and the Rebbeinu Tam held another way. This was a hot button issue once upon a time. But all of that is being pushed aside when we get to the late 1700s, early 1800s, and the European governments, without going into too much of an arichas, are saying that we're going to introduce capitalism, and it's going to be the jungle. If the guy can open another pizza shop, or 20 people can open a pizza shop, and somebody can come out with a cheaper product or a better product or attract more customers, then the first one will go to the wall. Then the first guy will go under and his family will starve, and that's the price you have to pay for progress. And one of the things that happens, therefore, is that lots of pizza shops and butcher stores and factories for making clothes that replace the old tailors and the shoemakers are opened. And the result is that for the first time in Europe, you get large cities. Millions and millions of people, tens of millions of Europeans moved to cities in the 1800s. Think about that. That's actually a revolution. It's a quiet revolution, but it's a revolution. It happens all over Europe. And the reason they moved to cities is because until then, under the system that I described before with the pizza shop, the city has laws that outsiders can't move in. It's called serfdom. That's the idea of serfdom. You keep everybody else on the countryside. The city has to be small because I don't want, God forbid, somebody to interfere with me being under the pizza shop. And so a city will be 3, 4, 5, 6, 10,000 people, something like that, typically. You don't want to get too big. Now the opposite. Now cities become aggregates of millions, which is unprecedented in history. And this brought, as some may know, a whole set of social problems, which I'll just use the code word of sweatshops. And you understand what I'm saying. The factories, the industrial exploitation of the workers and all that, which reached extremes and led to socialism and all that as a counter-reaction. What about the Jewish analog? Millions of Jews. Well, 1 million or 2 Jews move to cities. Actually, millions of Jews, I think about it, in the 1800s, early 1900s. Meaning they're creating an entirely new reality that never existed before in Jewish history. Everything I described about traditionalism was founded upon and based on a certain model. That is a numerically small community. 100 families, 500 families, 1,000 families. 1,000 families is already big. Very big. Prague had 2,000 families. I told you it was considered crazy large. Today in Baltimore, I bet you at 2 or 3 shows they have 2,000 families.
3,100.
Mm-hmm. So the point is that there's a new social reality on the ground that exists. Jews are part of urbanization. They move to cities in huge numbers. Where are they moving from? Small communities. What's the difference between living in a small community on the one hand and moving to a large urban center on the other hand? I'll tell you what it means for traditionalism. What does it mean to be a member of a small community? There's pluses and there are minuses. What's the pluses of living and being a member of a genuine Gemeinschaft, a real community? You have people who know about you and care about you, and if you're missing, they look for you. And if you have a baby, people come and cook for you. And if you need help, hopefully they'll somehow or other help you. And things like that. You're not alone. What are the minuses of living in a small community? You're not alone. Everybody knows everybody else's business. They weren't organized for this purpose. Actually served as extremely effective social agents for conformity for thousands of years for members of religious communities. To put it in simple terms that we'll all understand, you weren't in shul on Tuesday. How many times can you be sick? No? The butcher says, I haven't seen your wife at the butcher shop. What's going on? You have no options. Everybody knows everybody's business. And that actually is a powerful social reinforcement for the norms, for conformity to the norms. We can smile and smirk. It's true, though. It's a very powerful reinforcement. I'm not talking about the formal coercion of a kehillah that'll beat you up or fine you. I'm talking about the fact that
social.
You better show up and show them, because everybody's going to know why. You see? And now all of a sudden, you move to Berlin, to Vienna, to Paris, to London. God help us, you move to New York, where there are 3 million Jews packed into New York by the time this process is finished. There were not 3 million Jews in the world in 1800. And all of a sudden, I didn't see you in Shul on Tuesday. Where were you? I went to another Shul. I didn't see your wife buying the butcher shop. She started buying with somebody else. All of a sudden you have options. You have the anonymity that urbanization affords. And that actually, although it wasn't designed that way, acts on its own as a powerful asset on the cohesion that was such a large part for 1,000 years and more than 1,000 years in the Constitution and the keeping together of Jewish communities. Now, you and I know, with 2020 hindsight, that what needed to be done by the unprecedentedly large and new Jewish communities was to take appropriate steps to respond to this situation. What appropriate step would be necessary to respond to this situation? Schools, or as we call today, day schools. Nobody realized that in the 19th century, other than Samson Raphael. It's interesting. You go across the map of Europe, and you move to America and other countries. I'm not telling you anything that you don't know. There were no day schools. There were no Beis Yaakov. There was no nothing. And so what are we talking about? People moving from small communities in which life is circumscribed by social convention and busybodies, on the one hand, and religious mimesis on the other, to a new environment which is radically different, where now you have a privacy, and you can be as unfirm as you please if that's your cup of tea. And more importantly, your children are going to go to a public school, and they're not going to go to a Jewish school. There's not going to be any kind of countervailing Jewish influence in their life to make up for the loss of the communal cohesion that the parents lived in small communities when they existed. If you don't have, I'll say, today it's a truism. What I'm saying is obvious. For some reason it wasn't obvious 150 years ago, 200 years ago, even 100 years ago, and in many places even 50 years ago. I don't have to tell you, when the day schools were started in America, there was an uphill struggle. And it still is an uphill struggle. And no one realized this. And so we have, as the 1800s move on, moving from the 1700s and 1800s, the process will end with 100,000 Jews in Berlin, for example. There was a community of 100,000 Jews. In whole Germany there weren't 100,000 Jews in 1700. In one place. In Paris you'll have 200,000 Jews. In Vienna you'll have 180,000 Jews. In Budapest you'll have 190,000 Jews. In London you'll have 200,000 Jews. As I said before, in New York you'll have 3 million Jews. In Chicago you'll have 500,000 Jews, something like that. These are numbers which went way beyond the ability of the traditionalist system to accommodate. It wasn't built for that. It wasn't designed about that. In fact, it never was designed at all. It organically evolved from the Roman Empire over long periods of time in small, quiet communities. And now it's faced with the radical new realities of modernity and is not able to adjust to it. And so, I never like to read or hear people say that people became irreligious, to use that word, over the 18 and 1900s because Reform Judaism or this or that, Zionism or secularism. As far as I'm concerned, if we're talking at the mass level, we have to use sociology. We have to use social history. If you're at the mass level, it's quite simple. It's urbanization and the lack of education. And now that you heard it, you know it's true. Because you look at Baltimore, look at New York, look at Berlin, look at any place, look at Warsaw, and look at Vilna. What I'm describing that didn't only take place in Central Europe and in Western Europe and the United States, it took place in Eastern Europe as well. There was a constant hemorrhaging out that no one knew how to stop from the ranks of traditionalism down to around the 1960s. That's quite a statement. All through the 1810s, 1820s, 1830s, 40s, and so forth, down to around the 1960s. You had big rabbis, you had smart people, you had very learned types and all the rest of it. Nobody came up with a formula. They're standing there helpless. As the decades go by, while their own children and their own grandchildren leave. I don't say they leave screaming and kicking, because as I said before, that's actually not what happened. And urbanization and education is a quiet process. The kids moved to Baltimore. The parents moved to Baltimore from Russia. This is something that some of us will be familiar with. And they live in East Baltimore. And their kids will go to public school. And the Jewish education will be very inadequate. And then they'll go to college if they're successful. And they're becoming different people. You're not the same person just with a college education. You're becoming different people. You're culturally being transformed, and the parents realize it or don't realize it, the rabbi realizes it, doesn't realize it. Nobody has any answer to that. Nobody has any answer to that. As we'll see, few people, very few people, called attention to this in the 19th century. They were not really listened to. And it took till very late in the 20th century for this came to be seen as sort of self-evident, which is strange, but it's a fact. So if the religious Jews, when asked the question, who is responsible for the fact, the overwhelming fact of the modern period, that the vast majority of the Jewish people chose, nobody forced them, they chose to leave tradition. Well, the answer is the traditionalist Jews themselves. Look in the mirror. It's uncomfortable, but it's a fact. And what's interesting is, once they figured out how to do it, which is in the period after the Second World War, in this country, after they started to do this after the First World War in Europe, the hemorrhaging stops. So the history, taking a grand sweep of traditionalist Jewry, religious Jewry, is that there's a constant hemorrhaging out till around 1970 or so, and then it stops. Of course, by then, the traditionalists are reduced to a very tiny minority. But it's interesting that it stopped. If anything, there's a little bit of a return in the other direction, but very little. And all this, broadly speaking, in terms of the masses, is due to urbanization and the education that I just described. Because most people don't read Maskilic literature. Most people don't read books by Reform rabbis or secular theoreticians or historians. I'm not going to embarrass people by saying how many people, read a history book or a philosophy book or anything like that. That's not what people do. The Haskalah certainly wasn't the answer, because the Haskalah, which went in three waves, first in Berlin in the late 1700s, then in Central Europe and Galicia primarily in the early 1800s, then in Russia in the later 1800s, the Haskalah defined itself as being a Hebrew culture. It communicated in the Hebrew language. Newspapers, journals, novels. Mendelssohn himself wrote in Hebrew when he wrote to Jews. Now I'm ask a very uncomfortable question. I won't. But the uncomfortable question, who can read a Hebrew essay? Who in the 1790s or the 1890s in Europe can read Hebrew beyond the Siddur and all the rest of it? Who has the patience to read a novel? This was a culture that was a high culture, that designed itself as a high culture. And that's not the reason people, quote unquote, become not religious. It's because, I say, of grand sociological trends, which are obvious to every European historian, and which define our current reality, but we're so used to living in urban centers that we think this is the way it always was. And it wasn't. Once upon a time, Baltimore was a little nothing. And that's true of all the cities. And that's true of all the Jewish communities. And when there were little nothings, it was easier, as I said before, to keep them down on the farm. But I don't want to be reductionist about this. You can't just ascribe it to what I just said, although you can at the mass level. We still have to ask ourselves the question, but what about the Jewish intelligentsia? Why didn't the educated Jews in the 70s do something about it? That's a fair question. And here we have to deal with some very broad trends. This map, as you see over here, is Europe in 1715. By the late 1700s, it didn't look very much different. And the Jews everywhere, as I mentioned earlier in class, couldn't hope to have civil rights because every state on this map defines itself as a Christian state. And if it's a Christian state, that means it's a state that was formed, let's be very clear about this, it was a state that was formed at its highest to promote the religious interests of Christianity within an English context, within a French context, and so forth. The titles of the rulers of Europe, I mentioned before, in France, His Most Christian Majesty, in Spain, His Most Catholic Majesty. In England, the Queen is still called Defender of the Faith, after Henry VIII. They saw religion and Christianity as very central to their identity. If that's true, obviously there can be no equality for Jews. They're not Christians. That goes without saying. The most you could ask for someone like Mendelssohn, was tolerance, which is not equality. Right? Tolerance means you're a second, third class citizen here. I'm doing you a favor by letting you live here, but I'm not going to be so hard on you. I'll let you live like a human being. But of course, don't you have any pretensions that you're an equal member of the society, because obviously you're not a Christian. The best example that illustrates what I'm talking about would be England. England in the 1700s and the early 1800s till 1859, the Jews did not have civil rights there. The English did not persecute them. There were no laws on the books limiting a Jew from going into any business or residence. There were no laws, or gezeros as we call it, hurting Jews, but you couldn't vote. Couldn't go to Oxford and Cambridge, because in order to graduate from there you have to take an oath as a Christian. What is that? You can't have equal rights. Now, if you're a continental Jew living in the 1700s in England, you say that's very good, because whereas in other countries you can't even get married, in England they don't bother you. But if you're talking about actual equality, it wasn't in England until the year before the Civil War, 2 years before the Civil War. Think about that. In England, it was a pretty liberal country. And when it was the law giving Jews civil rights in England was passed in 1859, it had to be passed in what they call midnight session of Parliament, like they do in Maryland, 5 minutes before 12, when all the dirty stuff happens. Right? And it's due to the fact that Disraeli at that time was the leader of the Conservative Party in the House of Commons. Now, in 1789, many may recall, unexpectedly, the French Revolution broke out. And they stormed the Bastille and they arrested the King and the Queen. Within a few years, they chopped off the heads, as we all know, the King and the Queen and a lot of other people. And the people that led the French Revolution in the first phase were radical atheists. These are people who understood themselves as followers of Voltaire and Diderot, the great writers and thinkers of the French Enlightenment, who were radically opposed to religion, particularly Christian religion. And they totally reconstituted France. They said these words when they got together and formed the French Constitution. We are not a Christian state. We are starting something brand new, which is called a secular state. And the idea of French is going to be redefined. They actually killed all the priests they could find. They destroyed or appropriated all the churches that they could get in the first phase. And they had a big agenda of how to change the country. The laws of the nobles and the peasants, obviously, the holdings of the church, the royal family. One of the items on the agenda, not the only item on the agenda, was what do you do with the Jews? Because until then, the Jews in the Kingdom of France were located legally within the category of Jews, which is a separate category. They are a religious group allowed on sufferance to live in certain parts of France, subject to all kinds of rules and regulations, some which were harsh and others were not so harsh. And it went without saying that they have no rights, they have no claim to equality, but that's as long as France is a Christian country. All of a sudden these guys, not thinking about the Jews, but for their own purposes, said that Christianity is untrue, and all religion is. And instead, the only reality is the secular reality, and the state has to reflect that. And now France means anybody living in France. So what do you do with the Jews? Here they suffered a kind of cognitive dissonance, because all these people are very anti-Semitic. Well, unfortunately, all joking aside, the French are very anti-Semitic. I'm talking about the intelligentsia. And I might say that Voltaire and many of the other leading lights of the French Enlightenment were violently anti-Semitic. Arthur Hertzberg has a whole book on this. French Enlightenment and the Jews. The bottom line is Voltaire tried to do a currency swindle with a Jew, and then he tried, which they did, and then he tried to swindle the Jew, and the Jew ended up swindling him, and ever since then he swore, vengeance on all the Jews. When he was staying for a little while as a guest of Frederick the Great in 1745. Whatever the case is, Voltaire said, obviously, we want to get rid of all religion, we want to bring in civil rights, except the Jews, who represent an evil clan with such terrible habits, they're accepted from the liberalism that we extend to everybody else. Well, he was dead by then. He died 2 years before the French Revolution. The ideas that people express are often more powerful than the prejudices of the people that give voice to those ideas. Now look at the United States. Many of the people, as we know, who are the founding fathers and who wrote, Thomas Jefferson including, that all men are created equal, had slaves. And what happened? It took a while, but after a while, the words that they put on paper proved more powerful than the original interpretations and limitations they gave upon them because of their own contemporary social background. Now, whatever Jefferson or Washington themselves had in mind, after a while, we all know American history, the contradiction was too great, and we had a civil war, and everybody had to be made equal. A similar kind of thing happened in France in 1790. They said the country, yes, France, the country's reorganized as a secular state, therefore everybody has to be equal. What do you do with the Jews? Well, it can't be the Jews. That doesn't work. That's not logical. And so they said, we're going to have to bite the bullet, hold our nose, and give the Jews civil rights, and that's what they did. In 1790, they gave it to the Sephardic Jews, who were a little more westernized. In 1791, they really held their nose and even extended complete and total civil rights and equality to the cursed Ashkenazic Jews of Alsace, who spoke Yiddish, and were very clannish, and looked exactly like in Eastern Europe and Poland. Let me put it this way. The rabbi in Metz, just before the French Revolution, with the Chagas Aryeh, was not exactly French. It was extremely traditionalist community, but they had to give them the civil rights. Well, this led to a very interesting set of events because, again, when they chopped off the head of the king and queen and did all these radical changes in France, the rest of Europe was horrified, and England and Prussia and some other countries organized a coalition, and they invaded France from all kind of different directions. But the idea was to crush the revolution and restore some kind of monarchy and get rid of this Mishigas. It didn't happen that way. To everyone's surprise, the French defeated all of Europe and conquered all of Europe in the next 20 years, between 1790 and 1810. Look at this map, and look at France in relation to all the other countries. And now, if Jake will do so, give me the other map of Europe in 1810. And there's France. All this area is what they control. Everything. Right? The French Empire. Because of the what they call the French Revolutionary Wars, the Marseillaise, in which they defeated all the invading armies, and then under Napoleon they conquered Italy, all of Germany, a lot of Austria, Spain even. I mean, I don't have to tell you, we all know Hitler got to Moscow. Napoleon got to Moscow. And in the process of these wars, the French, who had been attacked, counterattacked, and let's say took over Italy, to give one example. Well, what was going on in Italy in 1797 when Napoleon Bonaparte led his famous campaign that in a single year he conquered all of Italy? Well, he came across towns like Milano and Torino and Venice and Genoa and eventually Florence and Pisa and Livorno and Rome. These are towns that had ghettos ever since the 1500s. These are towns in which Jews lived in the radically difficult pre-modern environment of discrimination. Yeah, they had their kilos, they did have their autonomy and all that, that is true. They also had a very difficult lifestyle. I'll speak a little bit about more than a few minutes. And it was hard. And all of a sudden the French army comes in, and one of the things the French army does is get rid of the existing government. For example, they took over Venice. You may see over there, Venice was a whole country, not just a city, this whole area. Well, Venice has all these laws about the Jews. They can't do this, and they have to live here and there, and so forth. And here comes the French Revolution. Here comes the French Revolution, and they do conquer Venice. And what they say is, we're going to get rid of the existing government of Venice and replace it with a French-type government of Venice, which means they're going to put in their ideology, just like the Russians did when they went into Eastern Europe at the end of the war. They imposed their social system. And one of the items on the agenda is that you have to have civil rights for the Jews, and that's what happened. So the Jews in Venice, who until then had to renegotiate their rights to live in Venice every 10 years. 1480, 1490, 1500, 1510. Every 10 years, the Venetian Senate held it over their heads that if we don't work out the financial arrangements to our satisfaction, or even if we do, if it's to our satisfaction, we can expel you. And they very often, in the 16th century and 17th century, threatened to expel the Jews from Venice. It never happened. But nobody knew it. And all of a sudden now, the Jews are declared complete and equal Venetian citizens with everybody else. No more ghetto. Venice is the oldest ghetto, going back to the early 1500s, And all of a sudden the Jews don't have to leave the ghetto because of some stupid outside reason, because Napoleon defeated the Venetian army and the Austrians that were, nearby, and as a side effect, the Jews roam where the Pope lives. You may remember that Napoleon had his disagreements with the Pope, so he arrested the Pope and held him in a jail in a palace in Fontainebleau until he was conquered in 1814. And so, for 15 years, Rome is, as you see on the map over there, part of the French Empire. And the Jews of Rome, it's notorious, the Roman ghetto, don't have to live in a ghetto anymore. And they can vote even. And that's just one example. When you get to Germany, you have a similar kind of model. And what I'm trying to say is, in a completely unexpected manner, very early on, the Jews across a lot of Europe gained overnight, through no actions of their own, complete and total civil equality and civil rights, emancipation as they refer to it, in large territories of Europe. Even in Prussia, which was defeated by Napoleon, wasn't occupied by him, they didn't give the Jews complete civil rights, but they eased up greatly on the civic disabilities to which the Jews were subject. Only in Austria they would not do that. They wouldn't ease up over here. And it was like a new day for the Jews in terms of their civil rights. Now, Napoleon had his problems with the Jews, and eventually he changed his mind. He wanted to pull back the civil rights and all. That never happened because he was defeated. But leaving all that aside, the nature of Jewish life, the kahillas, the coercion, everything was described, the insularity, obviously had to be radically impacted by this seesaw situation that I'm describing over here, where all of Europe is at war, and big wars, and one of the results is the Jews are getting civil rights, and the local people don't like it. It's being imposed by the occupiers. It's being imposed on the point of French bayonets. Think about this for a second. In 1808, Napoleon gets involved with a war with Spain, and comes in a single campaign, conquers almost all of Spain and Portugal. I have to tell you, in 1810, in 1808, they still have the Inquisition. They're still burning people. And here all of a sudden, Spain gets a new king, Napoleon's brother, and a new constitution which says Jews have complete and equal civil rights with every other Spaniard. You realize how counterintuitive this was, and how ideologically driven it was. Well, the result of all this is that, we don't have it on this map. You don't have a map after this, do you? 1815? Good. That's right. The result is that when Napoleon is defeated at Waterloo, to use a word that you'll be familiar with, the European governments come together in the Congress of Vienna in 1815, and they say, our main goal is to restore, the restoration they call it, to restore their status quo ante, and to put things back, put the clock back to where it was before the French Revolution had started, including getting rid of Jewish civil rights. And they do it. The only country that retains Jewish civil rights after defeating Napoleon was France. Every other country over there in Italy, the Jews are forced back into their old situation, the ghettos and all the rest of it. And same thing in the German states. The Germans are not forced back into the ghettos, but they're still subject to all kinds of civil disabilities and lack of rights. And a lot of them mattered, some didn't, and some did. The Jews of Germany respond to this with obvious shock, because it's worse to be let out of jail for 5 minutes and then be told to go back in. Right? She never let me out in the first place. And this engendered a desire on the part of the Jews in the different German states to regain those civil rights that they had enjoyed for a short period of time under the Napoleonic regime. And they conducted a kind of civil rights struggle, because that's what it was, the kind of civil rights struggle for the next generation or two, from 1815 to 1870. 55 years. Nobody thought it would take that long. And all during this period, the different German states would not grant them any kind of civil rights. And who are we talking about when we're talking about the Jews of the German states? These are the kids who've already been educated in the Maskelic system of schools that I described to you earlier tonight. They're a generation that has grown up with an attenuated traditionalism, a weakened sense of old Jewish values. I didn't say they were Reformed. Reform hadn't started yet. They're a different generation because of the education that they've experienced and the ups and downs in the political situation that they've experienced, which are radically different than anything traditionalist Jews had known forever. And they basically say to the German governments, give us civil rights. The French did it, why don't you? And the German governments in the 19th century, after the French Revolution, even though they suppressed the French Revolution, there was already a certain political correctness that had emerged, and they couldn't say, we hate you because you're Jews. Those words didn't work. But you don't have to use those words. You can use circumlocutions. And the German governments never really responded formally to the Jews, but they indicated that the reason you can't get civil rights is because you're not German. Let's face it, you yourselves admit you're not German. You're Jews living in Germany. That's what you've always been. You define yourselves as a foreign group living here on sufferance. And the German Jews say, well, no, but we're living here a long time. We really are German. And the Germans indicate, but wait a minute, you talk different. You dress different. Look at your sitter. You have different national aspirations. How can you say that you consider yourself a German when you pray to be restored to Zion? It's a fair question. They say, well, the French did it. The French were governed by abstract ideals. They are. Liberty, equality, and fraternity are abstract ideals. In Germany, such an ideology never took any root. The German historians till this day are wondering why such an ideology never took root. They're wondering why did their country end up having Hitler and the other countries didn't. And the German thoughtful historians speak about a Sonderweg, that the Germans went in a different way than the other countries. But it happened. And instead, what the German governments and states said in the 1800s, or indicated is a better word, has to do with the idea of a folk and a folkishness, which means being German is not simply a matter of residing in the country. Being German is a matter of a certain ethnicity, perhaps even a certain race, certainly something in the kishkes, in the genes. And you Jews don't have it, and be fair about it, you admit you don't have it. Well, what can I tell you? The German Jews in the 1800s felt very uncomfortable with this, because it meant that you would have to go back to a kind of existence which had been very unpalatable. I want to give you two examples of this. If you want to have an idea of what it was like under the old system, if you want to know what the Frankfurt ghetto was like, I'll read to you for a minute or two, not even that, from one source. You'll get a little bit of an idea of why Jews in the 1800s would do almost anything to get a better deal. The ghetto in Frankfurt, which had been around for many, many centuries, was governed by something called the Stedtigkeit, which was a statute that was read out in the shul in the main synagogue every year. Under its terms, which remained in force till Napoleon, the Jewish population was restricted to 500 families. The number of weddings was rationed to 12 a year. You're only allowed to have one wedding a month. And the age of marriage was 25. You're not allowed to get married at 25. These are the good old, pre-modern, traditionalist world European government attempts to hold down the population. You don't let them get married, or if you do, you let them get married very rarely, and then in an advanced stage and all the rest of it. And it goes on to say all kind of different things, that the Jews are confined to the ghetto every night, and on Sundays and during Christian festivals, and at other times they were forbidden to walk in the town more than two abreast. They were barred from entering parks and inns and coffee houses and the promenades around the town's picturesque walls. They were not even allowed near the ancient cathedral. They had to enter the town hall by a back door. They were permitted to visit the marketplace, but only during set hours, and they're forbidden to touch vegetables or fruit there. If a Jew appeared in court, he had a different oath, and so forth and so on. How big was the ghetto? It was just a quarter of a mile long. Think about that. How big is a quarter mile? Yeah, exactly. 3 blocks, something like that. The whole ghetto was a quarter mile long and no more than 12 feet wide. Means the street. Right? Think about that. It's 3 blocks. This is the ghetto. It's 3 blocks with the street 12 feet wide, and in some places less than 10 feet wide. Having originally been designated at a time when the Jewish population was little more than 100, they never changed at all. By 1711, the Jewish population was over 3,000. 3,000 people. There's some physicians here. 3,000 people in 3 blocks with a street this wide. So naturally, you had to build the houses way up high. Correct? And accommodating most such a small area required a high degree of architectural ingenuity. Houses were just 8 feet wide and had up to 4 stories. This is the way it was until the 1800s. That's what I'm trying to tell you. If the German government say we want you to jump through hoops in order to qualify for civil rights, most of the German Jews will be very willing to jump through hoops. You can't blame them. If you're a parent, if you're not a parent. But think about what I just said. Now this is a radical case. This is not the way it was everywhere in Germany. I don't want to give a misimpression. But there were similar situations in quite a number of places, and there were other types of disabilities which weren't as radical as this, but nevertheless were very irksome. And the reason I'm saying this is to explain what I'm about to talk about, and that is the Jews in the German states, exactly on this, respond in the first half of the 19th century by basically saying like this: tell us what you want us to do, and we'll do it, and give us the doggone civil rights. Now the Germans never do that, and the Jews go on their own. They say, well, we have to change the way we dress. So they do. They have to change from Yiddish to German. So we do. You don't have normal school, so they'll go to public school. Your manner of customs is outlandish. We'll change the customs. There's a wonderful handout. Well, before I show this, let me just make a point. The German Jews were 100% willing, the overwhelming majority of them, 100% willing, to institute internal changes in the period between 1815 and 1870 and afterwards even, in order to win the respect of the non-Jews, in order to get civil rights. This is the first time that we find such a radical change in the traditionalist mentality. For century after century before that, Jews were defined as the Hasidim are today. That I don't care less what you think about me. I'm addressed the way I dress, I am who I am, you are who you are, and literally, your condescension doesn't enter into my thinking at all. You obviously can think what you want about me, I can think what I want about you. Voltaire complains because he was passing in a carriage near a palace, and he sees a Jewish beggar in rags. And Voltaire was an aristocrat. And their eyes meet for a second. And afterwards he writes, he says, that son of a gun, he was looking at me like he's superior to me. And it was true. Right? Because he's looking at Voltaire and he's thinking, here's a guy. No, that's true. What about the fact that he's in a Cinderella carriage and he's in rags? Now that's the traditionalist mentality. This changes for the first time. In the wake of everything I'm speaking about, people all of a sudden really care, and care a lot. And they implement efforts to reform Judaism. That's not necessarily the same thing as reform Judaism. So I always distinguish in my classes and lectures between Reform A and Reform B. It's very important to make that understanding. Reform A was a movement by Balabatim. Reform B was a movement by rabbis. Reform A is not ideological. It's social. Reform B is ideological and very extremely anti-traditionalist. Reform A was implemented by the Gabbais, the board directors of towns all across Germany. Orthodox reform doesn't matter because all of a sudden there's a new atmosphere out there, perhaps as a result of their weakened sense of Jewish identity implemented by the Maskilic school system that kicked in the 1780s and 90s, as I indicated before. That's very likely. But whatever the reason is, we find all across Germany, as we get to the 1820s and 30s and 40s, a whole bunch of Synagogsordnungen, which means they want to change the rules of how one acts in the synagogue and outside, all of which are aimed at decorum and ameliorating, doing away with anything that could possibly, make someone who wasn't Jewish have an unpleasant impression whatsoever. And so, here, What do you got? Yeah, this is just the beginning of them. You have different towns and places there. There's a wonderful article by Professor Lowenstein, which I can't obviously give out to everybody, but I copied the best part of it, and Jake put it into a nice form over here. Here's a summary, and you see perhaps Westphalia and Baden and Munich, and what's the other one, Behof or something, I can't see it. And it's a small piece of a much larger chart in which you have one Jewish German community after another during the period I'm speaking about, in which they pass Reform A, in which the boards of directors and the Balabatim say from now on, no private minions. No children are allowed in under a certain age. A private minion is a messy affair. Your next door neighbors are Christians. What's going on over here? Come in the middle of the night, the middle of the day, they're going to make noise, defend the zoning rules. Children will make noise in shul. Private shiurim will make noise in people's houses. Early Hashkama minyan is at an ungodly hour. Right? Go. Move to the next one. Look at this. They pass rules. No swaying during prayer. No loud praying with the cantor. No Haman's club. No hitting with the groggers. No leaving the seat to kiss the Torah. Because God forbid a Christian should walk in and see a whole bunch of people running in when they take the Torah and loud. Right? No disturbance, no unfug on Tisha B'Av, which means there's people crying. These are unchristian, you see. When I say unchristian, they were not in conformity with the Protestant North Christian mores that were defined in German culture in the 19th century as the right way to be. No disturbance on Simchas Torah, you can just imagine that. Right? No disturbance on the Shana Rabbah. No noisy beating of willow branches. Go on. No makas, no flags on Erev Yom Kippur. No manfirin. Used to be, from the Ramah speaks about, from the earlier times, from the Maril, that at Jewish weddings they used to throw wheat. And actually, you might say like this, that's very Christian. Apparently, that wasn't the custom in Germany. No appearing in stocking feet at Tisha B'Av. You don't go, you wear slippers without leather. In other words, you can't. It's too Oriental looking. Right? It's too uncouth. The Kohanim can't wear socks. They have to wear slippers. No loud kissing of the tzitzis. No putting on tefillin itself, in the synagogue itself. A Christian will come in. I'm sure many of you saw that some guy was arrested on the bus in Chicago the other day for putting on the tefillin. No special singing of prayers for women who emerge from confinement after giving birth. They have a smeichem b'tzesim. I don't know what that is. Some people may know what it is, but apparently, they make. But again, to you and I today in our current culture, what's wrong with people saying Simon Tov, Mazel Tov, and Shul? You don't do that. Somebody might be there. You see, it'll make an uncouth impression. And then how can you expect civil rights? No kissing of the curtain and arriving in the synagogue. No covering of the prayer shawl at weddings. Because it doesn't look dignified. You have to have something that... They have enough trouble with the chuppah as it is, but no breaking of a glass, no wearing torn clothes on Shabbos. Don't wear your uncovered arm with the tefillin. Right? Don't bring the lulav to the women's section. I imagine that probably caused a lot of going back and forth and noise. In a church, you don't make noise at the wrong time. You see? You're laughing. Don't put on the kittel in the shul. You have to in the vestibule. Doesn't look dignified. Low seats. Don't sit on the floor. Only chazan can shake the lulav. No dancing with the bride by the women during shacharis. Are you familiar? I'm not familiar with this. You see, from here you get wonderful insights into customs in old Germany. No badchens. Right? Wedding? No badchens, because that's undignified. Right? No mourners at the synagogue. No leaving during the memorial service. You don't want people going in and out of shul. You see where I'm going in. This is to be funny about it. You say this is the invention of the gecko. But it really is. But it's really not something to laugh at. No, seriously, it's not something to laugh at. And for those who choose to laugh at it, your parents and grandparents underwent the same thing when they came to the United States. Okay, what they call modern Orthodox. It's the same thing. The idea was a new sense of what's considered dignified and undignified, and that sense was generated by external concerns. The way you determine whether something's appropriate or not is, what will the others say? I can't tell you how radically new that is. Okay? but it kicked in, obviously. Finally, there's two more pieces of this pie, and that is that if we get to the level of the intelligentsia, one thing that happens in the first half of the 1800s, one thing that's happening is kids are going to school, some kids are going to college, some kids are even going to university. When you go to university, some people want to be a doctor. Well, there's nothing ideological about that. But some people want to go, and in the course of their college studies, they're going to study history and philosophy. What is history and philosophy in the 19th century in Germany? I can tell you that Germany invented the university as we know it today. The University of Berlin, which was founded by von Humboldt in 1810, is the father of all the modern universities. Down till the First World War, and even down till Hitler's time, if anybody from anywhere, whether from America or from China, literally, or from Africa, wanted to get a really first-rate education, you had to go to Germany. And that's the way it was. And I might say that Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore was founded as a German university. What was the ideological message being given over there? To use two words, or two terms, idealistic philosophy on the one hand, and historicism on the other. The great teachings of philosophy, German philosophers, started in the late 18th century and reached their peak in the early 19th century. The names of Kant and Hegel may mean something to some people. Schopenhauer. If you're a Jewish boy and you're going to university, whether in Bonn or Heidelberg or Berlin or anywhere else, what are you hearing in the lectures? You're hearing the foremost philosophers in the world, the foremost experts in philosophy in the world, who are evolving what's called idealistic philosophy. They take Plato's idea of the ideal and say that's the ultimate reality, and you see trends and progress in history. And let's face it, in Europe there had been scientific progress in history, and you say that this is a world force, and that all of reality is guided by this world process. Now where does Judaism fit in here? Judaism is an early, primitive thing that was left way back when, taken over by the much more advanced Christianity, which has finally reached its peak in nowadays Protestantism. That's how they said it. Kant and Hegel and all the others, after an objective view of all reality, came to the conclusion that the perfect system is the one currently in Prussia of a modern Protestant German, religious / bureaucratic state. They really did. You can laugh at it today. If your son or daughter, and in the 19th century sons, if your son goes to college, and that's what you hear all the time, then it means that even when you do your dissertation, all the rest of it, it's going to have to conform to what they want. And one of the things you're going to have to say is, indeed, Judaism is a primitive, retrograde phenomenon. Many will remember perhaps Toynbee, who spoke about a fossil. And he was not exceptional. He was giving the general trend. And the intelligentsia are going to be, the Jewish intelligentsia are going to be the young Jews who are going to get an education. And what kind of an education are they getting? They're getting an education in which they're told that everything Jewish that has any value was taken by Christianity. Everything else was old and should not have survived until now. Even if you come out of there and don't convert, and it's not surprising, you can't blame them if many people convert after hearing this for 3-4 years. But even if you do, so now you have your PhD. What are you going to do with it? You can't teach in university unless you become a Christian. You can't get a job with the government unless you become a Christian. The leading Jewish student who founded the Verein für Wissenschaft des Judentums, the organization, the student union for pursuing Jewish studies, his name was Gans. He got number 1 in the law school. And the law school of the University of Berlin is like Harvard Law. So he was a brilliant legal student. And he got out, and what's a guy like that going to do? And he wanted to get a job, and they said, we admit that you're more qualified than anybody else, but we are not going to give you the job unless you convert. So he converted. And if that could happen to the chief of the, what shall I say, of the Hillel house, then don't expect anything different from others. And do not be surprised, therefore, if I'm describing a phenomenon that happens in Germany in the early 19th century. You can extend this all across Europe and America. There are people here in this audience who went to college, university before my time, and under the old system, in which, and even today in many places it's not so different, in which the message you get is Judaism, as the traditionalist Judaism, was a fossil and is fundamentally flawed. And the most you can do from that is to emerge relatively unscathed, and you can't. And so if you ask the question, what happens to the smart Jews, they are radically affected in an extremely non-traditional fashion by the education that they get at the universities. And out of idealistic philosophy comes Reform Judaism, as you and I call today. Right? Those students who end up with a PhD and cannot teach anywhere and cannot get a job with the government. There's only one job you can do with an education, unless you want to, flip hamburgers, and that is you can become a rabbi. A person who's going to become a rabbi of a community in Germany, like Abraham Geiger in Wiesbaden, or in Breslau, or even Frankfurt, and your doctorate consists of 3-4 years of being exposed to what I just described, the kind of Judaism that you're going to preach from the pulpit is going to be very different than the Shagas Aryeh. Right? In other words, that's Reform B. The ideologically driven attempt to redefine Judaism in a manner that will, I don't want to be vulgar about it and say, to make the professors feel good, because it won't, but to conform to current ideas in Germany. That's what eventually becomes Reform Judaism. So you do that through a process of essentialism. What you say is Judaism, like any other phenomenon, has essential core elements and non-essential parts of it. Well, we can get rid of the non-essentials and only retain the essentials. If you're a student like I'm describing, if you're Abraham Geiger, for example, or others, then you regard Torah, mitzvahs, and all the rest of it as non-essential, and regard, what shall I say, v'ahavta re'echa kamocha as the only essential, literally the only essential, and there's your Judaism. So you can change the Siddur, you can change the Chumash, you can change anything else. You can change, obviously, the worship service, you can change all the mitzvahs, because they're not essential. And after all, if all Judaism will be organized as a society for promotion of v'ahavta re'echa kamocha, who can object? Right? This is something even the professor will have to give credit for. So out of idealistic philosophy, in an unexpected and strange manner, emerges what we call one response to modernity, and that's what Reform Judaism is. The official Reform Jewish history tape, done by Professor Meyer, is entitled Response to Modernity, because he is a distinguished historian of the 19th century. Another big movement, with this I conclude, is historicism. For the first time ever, the study of history was founded on scientific principles. And, way overdue. Excuse me. We'll have to pick this up next time. We'll do 4 questions and then we'll break. What are the questions?
How long a period of time was the Napoleonic period of freedom that the Jews in this kind of German and European
I'll tell you,
area?
it's funny about it. Up to the Rhineland, the French had conquered in the 1790s. So if you lived in Dusseldorf or places like that, or Mainz, then you had your freedom from 1794 until the fall of Napoleon. On the other hand, the central part of Germany was conquered by Napoleon in a famous campaign in 1806, the Battle of Jena and Auerstedt. And so the Jews in Germany, as you call it, starts in 1806. 3 more questions.
The ghetto in Frankfurt that you were describing, was that a result of having the civil rights taken away after Napoleon?
No, the ghetto in Frankfurt I'm describing had existed since the 1300s.
Why did they go from the country to these cities?
No. The ghetto in Frankfurt was a small group and represented a fairly large Jewish community. It was exceptional in being an urban community, but to be an urban community, you had to suffer under those kinds of conditions. 2 more questions.
The older universities, such as University of Padua in Italy, where did they rank next to your discussion of the universities, modern universities being established in Germany?
I see you're asking a general question about the history of education. I'll deal with that later with you personally. That's a good question, but we don't want to get on that tangent. Are we done? Great, good night.
2 weeks. 2 weeks, the next session.
Yes.